Story 1. I was paid minimum wage at the time, working at a box store as a warehouse staff member. Someone completely destroyed one of the toilet stalls, creating a mess everywhere. I was asked to clean it, but I declined. I suggested, "We have overnight cleaners. Mark the stall out of service, and they can handle it." So that's what they did. There were no demands or repercussions for me. I thought, this is a biohazard level mess. I'm not cleaning that up, no matter how much you're paying me. Story 2. The store manager asked me and a few coworkers why we didn't chase after a customer who walked out of our bookstore without paying for a $100 textbook. Not only is that dangerous, but it is also against company policy for virtually all retail stores in the United States because it is unsafe. It is important to note that it is also against policy for our particular bookstore, as outlined in the employee handbook. Story 3. I worked at a large car rental company at Phoenix Airport as a manager, but the leadership did not appreciate my efforts. I was pointing out fraud from the agents and calling them out for failing to address it. Some agents would deceive customers into unnecessary charges and then yell at me upon their return. They assigned me a Wednesday to Sunday shift from 3 p.m. to midnight. During my second week on the schedule, we had a meeting with 20 people to review rentals versus available cars, and we were projected to be about 400 cars short during a shift where I was the only manager present. The director glanced at me and said, "Have fun with that," while laughing heartily. Following the meeting, I walked to a computer, emailed my resignation to Human Resources, and left. Story 4. I work on diesel trucks for a living. Truck drivers can be quite untidy. Sometimes we require them to have their trucks cleaned before we will work on them due to their condition. It's surprising how dirty they can be. Story 5. I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home while I was in college, typically on the full care ward. All residents were bedridden and required assistance with daily activities. The approved staffing model called for 1.5 nurses and 3 aides per wing, serving approximately 40 residents. During the afternoon shift, my duties included bathing, distributing dinner, feeding, cleaning, removing dinner, changing beds, turning residents twice to prevent bed sores, and clean up after incontinence. Due to many staff members calling out, the actual staff ratio was 0.5 nurses and 0.5 aides, which meant we were essentially responsible for 2 wards. It was incredibly challenging. We did our best and only paused to wash our hands. The care those residents received that night was inadequate. The way facilities balance staffing models for profit over care is concerning. I quit the next morning. Story 6. I briefly worked at Jersey Mike's Subs after I lost a full-time job. I am not sure why I took it, as the pay and hours were poor. They had steak and chicken in boxes in the freezer. One day, a woman yelled at me, a sizable guy, for going straight from handling the box to cooking the sandwiches, even though I washed my hands and changed my gloves as required. She chose to confront me while the store was crowded. At that time, I was also doing food delivery, which paid significantly more than that job. I used the tongs meant for grabbing the meat, took a slab of chicken, threw it at her, and then left. In that moment, I felt so satisfied that I didn't care about getting fired since the job was unpleasant anyway. Story 7. This old lady threw a pickle at me, and it stuck to my chest. That was rude, Susan. I didn't even take your order. I was making the sandwiches. The ticket didn't say no pickle, meanie. Story 8. A McDonald's regional manager I knew once mentioned in front of other workers that whenever someone quits, she knows they will return within a month. I decided to quit a week later when she asked me to work openings at 3 a.m. because she claimed to trust my work and said I did a good job. I realized she was insincere and had a low opinion of us, believing we would not achieve anything. Story 9. I was working in a type of dollar store while studying. The wage was extremely low, but there weren't many opportunities to make extra money at that time. My least favorite customers were those who seemed financially well off, judging by their clothes, makeup, hair, and attitude, yet were stingy enough to occasionally buy the cheapest items. They would then create a scene, demand refunds, and take up a lot of our time. This store chain was chronically understaffed. Often, one employee was expected to manage the entire store, which required being in multiple places at once. One day, While I was alone running the store, a woman approached me and desperately asked if her 3-year-old could use the employee restroom since there were no customer or public restrooms nearby. The girl was close to having an accident, so I showed them to our restroom. Since this was a sensitive area of the store not open to customers, I stayed with them for the brief moment it took. When we stepped back into the public part of the store, I was confronted by one of those affluent ladies. She had a tantrum because she was interested in a low-cost product but required extensive customer service to make a decision and couldn't find an employee. I apologized and calmly explained that I was alone in the store and had to manage the checkout, accept incoming deliveries, restock items, and handle various other tasks, not to mention the emergency restroom situation with the little girl. One would expect some understanding or empathy, but she showed none. Instead, she loudly berated me for allowing a 3-year-old to use the only restroom available. At that point, I couldn't help but laugh. Everything from the low-wage, exploitative job to this selfish woman demanding high-end service in a budget store, to an adult lacking any empathy for a child, was just so absurd. The thought, "I don't get paid enough for this," was definitely on my mind. Story 10. In high school, my best friend and I worked as dishwashers for a family restaurant. We earned minimum wage, and honestly, it was the hardest job I've ever had. The restaurant also rented an apartment to people who lived above it, and for no reason, my boss kept making their problems my problem. For example, one time they needed a new dishwashing machine, and my boss made me disconnect and carry down the old machine, then carry up and connect the new one. After that, he basically used me as a handyman. Once, he had me helping a roofer, which I only realized was unfair after I learned that the roofer was making thousands for the same work we were doing together. I learned a thing or two about roofing, but honestly, it's not a skill I've needed since, and it was not enjoyable. It gets extremely hot. But the worst day was when the people in the apartment threw a party, and someone vomited on the stairs leading up to their door. It was the middle of winter, and the stairs were outside, so the vomit froze solid and trailed down the entire staircase. My boss literally gave me a chisel and told me to chip it up and clean it. Day-old party vomit, a lot of it, from the top all the way to the bottom. Minimum wage. I told my boss absolutely not. He threatened to fire me, and I threatened to walk out. He eventually caved and offered me $100 if I'd just agree this once. I ended up doing it, but only because I knew I was quitting soon and wanted to save up. Story 11. Working in daycare. I have a college degree and earn slightly above minimum wage. During COVID, the toy shed in the play yard was taken over by some individuals using drugs. There was human waste, trash, and needles everywhere. Management expected us to clean it out. We refused, and they had to hire a special biohazard cleanup crew to address the situation. There's a reason I no longer work in childcare. Story 12. I worked for an attorney. It was just the two of us in the office. One morning, he came in upset because something was wrong with the computer at his house. We turned on the answering machine and locked up the office. He took me to his house, and I spent 2 hours sitting on the edge of his bed, reformatting his hard drive, because he had gotten into a loop on a website that he needed to clear before his girlfriend came home from work. After that, he started watching videos in the office. Story 13. I worked in a grocery store as a cashier when I was 17. When I saw people stealing, I always called a supervisor to address the situation. There was no way I was going to get involved in any trouble or confront a thief. Story 14. Minimum wage. First job at an amusement park. I was trying to change a giant trash bag on a rainy day when it suddenly sprang a leak, dousing me in trash juice. At the same time, a group of passersby began to catcall and verbally harass me. I was done and walked out mid-shift. Story 15. I was flying for a medical company in a cargo plane when the landing gear failed to extend. I was at about 1,800 feet with limited visibility due to fog on approach, and had to perform a gear-up landing. On my last attempt, before exhausting my fuel, I managed to get the main wheels down, but the nose gear wasn't fully extended. During the approach, I identified the approach lights and the runway environment. At that point, I shut down the engines and feathered the propellers to reduce the chance of a fire if I landed belly up. I managed to land it safely and sat on the runway, thinking it was 3 a.m. I almost died, and I'm making $24,000 a year for this. Story 16. I worked for our county's regional bus service as a driver. They wanted a 6 a.m. rollout, so I had to complete the pre-trip inspection and gather supplies before then. The clock-in time is at 6 a.m. Arriving at 5:55 a.m. is acceptable, but no earlier. How do I conduct the pre-trip inspection and rollout at 6 a.m. if I don't start work until then? You will figure it out. I do not work for free. I clocked in at 5:40 and addressed the issue of not being paid for that 20 minutes. I took them to court and received my back pay. It was not much, but they fired me for insubordination, which I earned. They corrected their behavior for a while. Story 17. I worked in a dog daycare and boarding center during winter. The employee who closed the night before neglected to clean the potty yard. With temperatures below freezing, outdoor play was not possible, only potty breaks. I arrived to find a yard full of frozen dog waste. The girl who closed the night before was working at the front desk, effectively acting as the supervisor for the day. She instructed me to take a bucket of hot water outside to thaw the waste and scoop it, even though it was her responsibility. I did it but decided not to return again. Story 18. Our office got a new cleaner on Wednesday morning, and on Wednesday afternoon, either an unhappy customer or a homeless person defecated on the floor of the public bathroom. The cleaner did not show up on Thursday morning. Story 19. When a customer asked me to unclog a toilet and handed me a spoon instead of a plunger. That's not just underpaid. It's a war crime. Story 20. I worked as a bartender in a local pub, the kind that has a lot of regulars and older patrons spending all day. It was an afternoon shift when one of the regulars came up to me and the assistant manager and pointed out a man who had just walked from the front door to the toilet, leaving a trail of mess behind. Despite being a woman, she charged into the men's restroom to kick him out. I heard a shout, and when I got in there, it was chaos. She was fending him off while he was fully naked, lunging and shouting, with mess smeared over his lower half. The walls of the cubicle, the floor, and the toilet were all covered. If I'm honest, I can't fully remember how it resolved itself, except that he left through a fire escape. We had to bleach everything and spray the toilet down with a hose. Story 21. I walked into a customer's house and was immediately swarmed by fleas biting my legs. The entire house was coated in cigarette tar and trash. He had 13 cats, all with fleas. I politely left and went home for a decontamination shower and a change of clothes. Story 22. I worked at a wastewater facility for a while as an instrumentation and automation engineer. At our dewatering facility, one of the main pumps stopped, and the mechanics suspected there was something in the pump blades. To drain the water and work on the pump, they shut off the valve for the incoming wastewater. However, they did not verify that the indicator had moved to the closed position after turning the handle. I was about 2 stories above them and could see the indicator was not fully off, so I yelled down to the mechanics as they loosened the cap on the check valve to inspect the intake side of the pump. They laughed until they removed all the bolts from the cap. Initially, nothing happened since the cap was sealed with some RTV-like sealant. When they started hitting it with a 5-pound hammer, they loosened some sealant and wastewater began spraying out. Not leaking as if the valve was closed, but erupting with enough force to shoot it 15 to 20 feet away. They continued hammering with no bolts in place, and that approximately 50-pound cap let loose all at once, blowing off the check valve as if it weighed nothing. Since the valve wasn't closed, that cap had the force of approximately 125,000 gallons of raw sewage pushing against it. Both mechanics were covered in a geyser of raw sewage erupting from the check valve. They were trying to retrieve their company-provided tools from the sewage and yelled for me and the technician with me to come down to help gather these tools. We obviously declined, watching them dig through a few inches to a foot to 2 feet of sewage. They only stopped because the water was getting waist deep. They ended up flooding the entire pump room with about 12 feet of wastewater, destroying the controls and other pumps in the process. With no working pumps, the plant had to divert all the incoming sewage into a field and the nearby river for several weeks and pay fines for the contamination. These individuals were actually upset when we told them to go to the hospital as soon as possible since hepatitis and other viruses are serious concerns. They did not go until their supervisor forced them to. Story 23. ice cream shop in my town. Bare minimum wage is $15 an hour, and tips were taken by management. One night, when we were extremely busy, a lady came in and ordered a milkshake from our menu but did not want certain ingredients. I went to make it without those ingredients and handed the drink to her. She came back and said it tasted funny. I was frustrated because she was the one who ordered it. My manager approached me and asked if I made the drink. I replied yes. He then asked if I followed the recipe, to which I said no because the customer didn't want those ingredients. The manager became upset, insisting that I needed to follow the recipe. I only worked there for a month before I was let go. Story 24. When they tried to restrict us to drinking water in the back room, I sincerely disagreed. I'm not doing that. Story 25. The officer who arrested me for public indecency. I am truly sorry to that individual. I am a different person now. Story 26. I was 15, working at McDonald's when a child soiled the play area tubes. I was asked to clean it up. I wasn't trying to be difficult. It was simply the fact that I was being paid $6.25 an hour and had no financial obligations. I would much rather walk out and find another part-time job that doesn't require cleaning messes for that wage. They didn't fire me, by the way. I believe we closed the play area, and the night cleaning crew handled it. Story 27. My first job as a nurse involved a psychiatric patient who physically assaulted me while attempting to leave the room. He was naked and wanted to walk down the hall, enter another room, defecate, and smear his feces on the walls. Story 28. I used to work in the electronics section of Walmart. One day, a very irate customer came in screaming because someone had sold him a digital camera that lacked a specific feature. I let him vent, and when he was done, I calmly informed him that I would find a manager for him to speak with instead. I did, and I thought that was the end of it. The next day, he returned, found me, handed me a gift card, and apologized for his behavior the previous day. I was a bit surprised, as customers don't usually do nice things like that, but I thanked him and enjoyed a free lunch. Sometimes things do work out nicely. Story 29. Not me, but my former boss and colleague. We used to work in technical support, and there was a model of tablet laptop that only very important persons received. All our laptop models were experiencing high rates of expanding lithium batteries due to off-gassing, which posed a fire hazard. However, this tablet model was rarer, so we didn't have many units available for replacements. My colleague received a ticket for a VIP who was preparing for important travel and had one of those tablets. The case was splitting apart because the battery was expanding. My colleague went back to the warehouse and pulled out every used tablet they could find, which were only 2, and discovered that both also had expanding batteries. They informed my boss, who decided that the VIP could borrow his battery since he also used one of those tablets. He opened it at his desk and found that the battery inside his tablet had expanded too, making it impossible to reattach the case. They then paid for overnight shipping to have a tablet sent from one of our out-of-state locations. It arrived, and its battery had also started expanding. Story 30. I manage a large retail store. An elderly man went to our customer restroom, apparently to empty his colostomy bag. It was 10 minutes after opening when it exploded all over the bathroom, making it impossible to see the floor. He tracked it throughout the entire store and did not say a word on his way out. We had to close the store because I refused to clean it and would not make my staff do it. I called a professional cleaning team and stayed on the other side of the store, working on stock and other non-customer-facing duties while the crew cleaned up. I was not going anywhere near that, nor was I about to make my team do it. Story 31. As a registered nurse, there is no monetary reward that can compensate for what I do. Fortunately, I am not in it for the money. Story 32. A bartender in a strip club handed a mop and instructed to clean the mess that was on the walls in the men's restroom, but not to worry about the women's restroom as it would be closed due to its poor condition. Story 33. Fresh off a sailboat after spending a few years in Mexico, I had no references, so I worked at Burger King to make quick money for a season pass at the mountain. I worked as much as they would let me, and 2 weeks in, the manager said there was an accident in the play tubes that I needed to clean. I was the biggest guy there by far. I'm 6 feet 4 inches and broad. I barely fit into the tube. When I reached the horizontal tube, I saw the reason for my spelunking. One of the little kids at the birthday party had an accident. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. I tried to get away, but I was exactly the same size as the tube on my hands and knees. I was completely covered and sliding in the mess. I essentially slipped down the slide, got out, and walked over to the manager. I had it in my hair and all over my jacket. He saw me and shook his head. "Where do you want your last check sent? You can keep the jacket." Story 34. I was a manager of a gas station for a brief time a few years ago. One night, a person under the influence caused a mess in the bathroom. There was waste on the toilet, the floor, and even on the wall. Story 35. I worked in loss prevention at Old Navy in Nashville. I have been followed, stalked, punched, kicked, pepper sprayed, stabbed, and threatened with guns. It is not worth it for me or the child with 3 fingers and half a foot who is involved in the product being stolen. Story 36. I was asked to join meetings during my wedding leave, 2 days after my marriage and during my honeymoon. I work in information technology. Story 37. I am a licensed veterinary technician. One time, a client brought in her own stool sample, insisting that her dog had parasites as well. She literally pulled out 3 Ziploc bags of her own stool from her purse for me to examine. I wish I were making this up. Story 38. I was working at a grocery store in California in 2015. Most days involved the usual small talk with customers, but on my last day, a woman came in who seemed to embody the stereotype Europeans joke about regarding Americans. She weighed over 300 pounds and had multiple chins. As she came through my line, I was scanning her groceries when she asked me, "Do you have this in a bigger size?" while pointing to an already large tub of ice cream. I looked at the tub and responded, "Sorry, ma'am, we don't have any larger sizes." She started getting angry, as if she were a slow version of a character from an action movie. She raised her voice, yelling, "You can't expect that tiny tub of ice cream to satisfy anyone." I tried to calm her down as other customers started to watch. Then my manager heard the noise and came over to assess the situation. The woman began screaming, accusing me of verbally assaulting her and being misogynistic. My manager looked at me in disbelief. I explained what had happened and pointed to the security camera above my head, saying, "You can check the footage." At that point, the woman started grabbing candy from the shelves and throwing it at me as I tried to block most of it while my manager backed away. She then reached into her bag, pulled out a 2-liter bottle of cola, opened it, and poured it on the ground. She deliberately slipped and fell in it. I struggled to hold back my laughter at the impact, but then she began screaming that I had assaulted her and that she was going to sue me. In frustration, I took off my vest, said, "I quit," threw it to the ground, and walked out of the store. Story 39. While in college in 1991, I had a job as a janitor in the dorms. One morning, a couple of us were walking through one of the floors and found a styrofoam bowl with waste in it and a little flag that said, "The bandit strikes." The next day, on the same floor, one of the guys went into the mop closet and smelled waste. Someone had put waste in a mop bucket, dipped their hand in it, and wrote on the back of the door, "The bandit strikes again." We started finding waste all over the place. The best incident involved throwing waste in a clothes dryer and turning it on. The final outrageous act was someone sitting on the top floor stairwell handrail and spreading waste all the way down to the bottom. It was moist and splattered all over the walls, stairs, and floor. I refused to clean any of it up because I was a student making minimum wage, and they pay people a lot of money to deal with situations like that. Story 40. I work as a janitor contracted through a business. On Friday night, I went to work cleaning the office I am assigned to, which is attached to a production warehouse, as usual. Everything went well, and I finished my chores. It is important to note that I have to clean the entire office and finish within a 3-hour time limit. We get in trouble if we exceed our allotted time. As I was shutting the place down and setting the alarm, I kept receiving a notification that main door was preventing me from setting the alarm. I kept trying to set it, override it, and confirm it, but nothing was working. I faced a dilemma. Should I risk getting in trouble and search the factory for the open door, or should I leave? I decided to leave. I called my manager and explained the situation. I told her it was beyond my responsibilities to search the factory for a door that should not be open, and I did not want to get in trouble for going where I was not supposed to. She said I handled the situation correctly, so everything turned out okay. But I did mention that it was not worth my effort since it was above my pay grade. Story 41. I worked at a dealership in the garage. One of our loaner cars came back with drug paraphernalia, blood, and various bodily fluids inside. The manager wanted someone to clean it, and as the newest employee, it fell to me. When I refused, the others asked if I was worried about being fired, and I said I would rather be fired than risk whatever disease might be hiding in there. Story 42. Working in healthcare during the COVID-19 pandemic was a challenging time, made even more difficult by being in a deeply conservative state. I was threatened at gunpoint, faced with a knife, and received blame from families for the deaths of their loved ones. I was spat on, verbally abused, and threatened concerning my life and my family's safety, all because I wanted their grandmother to breathe better. I received a one-time bonus of $500, with no pay raises during or after the crisis. I'm still here, still assisting patients with ventilators, oxygen, and continuous positive airway pressure devices, while not being compensated fairly. I just want people to have a good life. This situation is tough enough without also having to deal with incontinence due to breathing difficulties. As a side note, if you smoke, you should seriously consider quitting. Story 43. I work in a call center. The previous manager, who had been there for 20 years, used to turn the call volume down to only accept one caller in the final 15 minutes and asked coworkers to assist those on the phone in clearing out the remaining calls until the designated operator only had to deal with one. That manager retired over a year ago. The new manager does not turn down the call volume, so 1 minute before the end of the shift, we still have a full queue. You have to request help, and if you are the only operator there on a Friday, like I was 2 days ago, you end up staying much longer. My time after closing is valuable to me, and if I miss my bus, I spend 30 minutes waiting for the next one, 30 minutes I do not get paid for, and that's a 30-minute delay in my evening. That is 30 minutes I could have spent doing what I love. Story 44. I am working in government-subsidized retirement flats installing new heating systems. My colleague called me about a property he was at, stating he didn't want to fit the radiator in the bathroom because it smelled unpleasant. I went there thinking, let's just get it done. I opened the door to the bathroom, and it was a mess with waste everywhere, on the toilet seat and the wall beside where the radiator was to be fitted. After taking a couple of photos, the landlord advised not to fit the radiator, much to the relief of our team. It was probably one of the worst situations we have encountered as installers. Story 45. I worked in an indoor playground when I was 14 for below minimum wage, as underage workers do not have to receive minimum wage here. I earned €6 per hour when the minimum wage was €8.50 per hour. My regular job was washing dishes, but I occasionally did other tasks such as working at the register, taking calls, and supervising trampolines, while cooking was left to adults for insurance reasons. We had padded climbing mazes with tunnels, obstacles, ball pits, trampolines, and various slides. One day, a man approached me and a colleague at the cash register, saying his son felt sick and had a small accident in the maze. We asked where, and he indicated the red part, which was a 12-meter long and 4-meter tall segment. So the search for the accident began. We quickly realized the accident was not so small when we smelled it from 30 meters away. The child had projectile vomited in the ball pit and next to it on the padding, where a couple of kids had slid through, spreading the vomit all over the maze. The unpleasant smell led others to also vomit. So before we could close down the maze, a few other kids had emptied their stomachs inside. There were little vomit footprints all over the carpet in the entire indoor playground, with vomit-covered kids running around and spreading the smell everywhere. It took about an hour for everyone to leave the building, using the small outdoor water playground to wash their kids with their clothes on before taking them home. The water playground was activated specifically for that day because, although it wasn't freezing, it was around 15 degrees Celsius, and the water did not heat up. After we had nearly given out our entire supply of trash bags with holes cut for the kids' heads and arms to keep parents' cars clean, and everyone was finally gone, the manager came to us, me and 4 colleagues, including 3 minors and 2 18-year-olds, and told us she needed to make some calls while we could start emptying the ball pit. When we all declined, she offered us each €10 as compensation for the work. We said no again, after which she threatened to fire us since we were all still on the clock for 4 more hours. We wished her good luck in finding new employees. That smell is still imprinted in my nightmares. Story 46. I once worked in retail and had to scrape melted gummy bears off a display case because a child threw his snack into the heater vent. It smelled like burnt sugar and regret for weeks. I got paid $9 an hour to be a janitor, therapist, and referee. Story 47. I managed a photo department at Long's Drugs. A woman submitted negatives from her recently deceased father to be sent to the offsite Fuji lab. Either they lost the negatives or she hadn't completed the envelope correctly. She was in tears for about 15 minutes as I tried to comfort her, acknowledging that the chances of retrieving them were slim. I earned $7.50 an hour around 1995. Story 48. When I worked at Burger King as an opener, there was a customer who came at 6 a.m. on the dot, the time we opened, to complain about the Whopper they received the previous night. They bypassed the speaker, came straight to the window, and proceeded to scream at me as soon as I opened it. I closed the window promptly and clocked out. Story 49. I work as a produce clerk at a supermarket. One day, while I was putting out bananas, a woman approached me and demanded to know why I needed to touch every bunch. I asked her if she eats the peel and if she wanted me to put them out without checking. I pointed out that many others handle these bananas without washing their hands first. Story 50. One time, a man walked into the store and immediately saw me at the checkout. He opened his jacket and said hello before walking out. I am not sure if he was naked, as it all happened so quickly. That was about 10 minutes into my shift. Shortly afterward, a woman asked if I knew him. I told her I didn't, and she continued talking about how God loved me. The whole situation felt very strange to me. Story 51. The manager once ordered me, a server, to clean out a corner infested with cockroaches behind the hot food carts. I declined and quit a month later. Story 52. I worked as a janitor for about 7 years, and I noticed that the issues I encountered were often related to restrooms. People typically show little respect for public restroom facilities. Story 53. An old rat nest was found in an abandoned bathroom. My first job as a janitor involved trying to seal up the room and forget about it. However, someone saw me enter, and rumors began that another bathroom would soon be available because they were desperate for more. The owner of the company summoned me and asked if I had a list of items I would need to clean it. I wanted to scream and cry at the same time because I now had no choice. The owner wouldn't even buy a basic biohazard suit. I took my time with the task and completed it in a day, but none of those gossiping employees ever used the bathroom. It wasn't because it was still dirty. It was simply too far from their workstations. Story 54. 2 of them were in the same job. It was a seasonal part-time position at a pop-up Halloween store. The first incident occurred when I said the words out loud. A child started walking on a shelf that was only a few inches off the ground. It was one of those temporary metal shelves that use pegs to hang off a rack with holes to secure the pegs. The shelf then fell under the child's weight. I exclaimed loudly enough for the parent and other customers to hear that I didn't get paid enough for this while I picked up and reattached the shelf. The other instance was when we were cleaning up for the night at 10 p.m. and still open for another hour. We had to find and return products to the shelves they were supposed to be on after customers had misplaced them throughout the day. The assistant manager, who was younger than me at 17, started taking items they found and throwing them on the floor while insisting we needed to hurry because they wanted to go home on time. After dealing with that a few times, I decided to simply walk out without anyone seeing me and drive home. I was not going to deal with a teenager in a supervisory role throwing a tantrum and making my job harder in a temporary position. I was home and in bed before anyone even called to ask where I was. Story 55. So much negativity in the comments. My heartfelt apologies to all of you. I'm sorry that some people can be terrible. Story 56. An old retired drill sergeant was the manager of the shop floor where I worked. He came up to me one Monday morning and asked, "Did you enjoy your weekend?" Story 57. In 2003, I worked as a personal assistant to a successful mortgage loan officer. I was paid $6.50 an hour to handle most of the work under his guidance. He earned about $45,000 a month. My job was initially to manage paperwork, but over the course of the first 6 months, it evolved into much more. I answered all his personal calls to make him feel important. I processed applications, handled most client and in-house communications, picked up his dry cleaning, covered for his absences, tolerated his yelling and temper fits, reserved his hotel rooms, got his lunch, lied to his wife, and hid his multiple affairs. Each month, he wrote me a check for less than $2,000 while making me do the math on his $45,000 in commissions. The final straw? Paper cut. Stan, his real name, got a paper cut while reaching for one of the thick paper files that I meticulously maintained. He snapped, grabbed all of them, threw them into the air, and let the paper fall like confetti. Then he shouted, "Now pick it up." I told him I was taking lunch and that if it wasn't fixed when I returned, I would quit. I walked down the hall to the owner's office and informed him I knew they were hiring loan officers next month and I would be applying. I came back from lunch, and Stan had picked everything up but was even more difficult going forward. A few months later, I became his coworker. Story 58. We did not have paid overtime, and we had a significant project that was sold under an unreasonable budget, essentially cutting our regular production speed in half just to attract the client. As we continued producing, we informed upper management that we were not keeping up with the deadline and asked if they would like us to start working 1 to 2 hours of overtime each day to make up some time, noting we had an extra week of paid vacation available for regular overtime. They responded, "No, you shouldn't have to do that." So we did not. This was about 3 months before the deadline. 2 weeks before the deadline, they called an all-staff meeting and began by saying, "We know you have worked hard and that you do your best, but we also know that you can do a little bit more." Then, they requested us to work 4 to 5 hours of overtime per day. Having finally realized we were going to miss the deadline, with the client threatening hefty fines for any delays, the entire team was extremely frustrated. Everyone refused to work that amount of overtime without compensation, especially since we had offered to do so earlier for lesser hours. One of our senior artists remained in the meeting room with upper management and made it clear that the entire studio was united against them. If they wanted us to increase our hours, they needed to pay us overtime at the very least. He offered to mediate between the two parties to ensure the artists got back on track to complete the project. Upper management labeled him a rebellion leader and accused him of being a traitor to the company, which they suggested only cared about finances. It took a few days before they agreed to pay us, and I ended up working 75 hours of overtime in those 2 weeks. The rest of the team had similar commitments. Some team members even stayed at my home since it was closer to work, and we essentially worked around the clock. We managed to deliver the project on time, but it was absolutely not worth the effort. The pay we received was minimal compared to our contributions, and in the end, the company showed no concern for any of us. Never again, not even if they offered to pay me. Story 59. I worked as a nanny for over 2 years for a wealthy family. I became very ill and had to go to the hospital. I quit because their child passed an infectious disease on to me. They knew about it but did not inform me, and I became the sickest I have ever been. I quit without notice. Story 60. I was covered from head to toe in effluent. I know it's a risk working at a sewage plant, but it's unpleasant. Story 61. I was yelled at by a customer because she couldn't return an item, even though the receipt clearly stated the return policy and she was past the return date. I don't work at the registers. I was just the first person she could express her frustration to. Story 62. Meetings or annual general meetings for any voluntary activities have been calmer and more civil in my paid job, and that says a lot. Story 63. I experience these moments quite regularly. As a children's intensive care nurse, Anytime I have to perform CPR on a child or a child dies leads me to contemplate this thought. I wouldn't change my job for the world, but a pay rise would be nice. Story 64. I was an assistant guide at a summer day camp in ninth grade. We had a group of 4 to 6-year-olds, so my main job was to ensure none of them got hurt, which meant walking them around, mostly to the bathrooms while earning minimum wage. One time, I took a child for a bathroom break that ended up being longer than usual. I didn't notice until I was startled by a loud, "I'm finished." The child wanted me to help him wipe, which was far beyond my responsibilities. I gave a brief explanation on how to wipe and let his parents handle it at home. In summary, I worked as an assistant guide in ninth grade, and a child asked me for help with wiping. I declined. Story 65. A group of young men worked without personal protective equipment, using rakes, shovels, and wheelbarrows to clean up an illegal dump site on a Sierra hillside. An illegal septic pumper truck had dumped waste in the area. We weren't being compensated adequately for that work. The only positive aspect was that the waste had been sitting on bare dry ground, exposed to the summer sun at an elevation of 5,000 feet, for about a week. Story 66. I worked as a broil cook at a very busy restaurant called Applebee's. When I arrived 5 minutes late, the manager started to curse at me. I reminded him that I had closed the previous night and was there to work. He continued to curse, so I walked to the nearest point-of-sale terminal, clocked out, and left. I had worked there for over 2 years and loved the job. Story 67. I was working late-night maintenance at a large franchise restaurant. The maintenance manager said the main grill's braided stainless steel gas line was frayed. I suggested starting to shut down the fryers, but he replied that it would take too long and decided to change the gas line while it was still live. I walked out. Story 68. I worked at a seasonal kiosk in the mall, one of those sausage and cheese places only open from Thanksgiving to early January. Our store manager was difficult to deal with, and over the season, she showed up less and less. She got a job at the shoe store right next to us, would work an entire shift there, and acted as if being physically close to us was the same as being a manager. By the end of the season, she had stopped showing up entirely. Though she never officially quit, she ghosted us. One day, the regional manager came to the store and asked, "Where's your manager? She's been ignoring me when she's supposed to be working on the closing procedures." My coworker and I explained how our store manager had also disappeared. The regional manager replied, "I'll try to get in touch with her. You start studying up on the end-of-season work." She handed me a binder thicker than a phone book. I asked, "This says manager on the cover. Does that mean I get paid more?" The regional manager responded, "What kind of question is that? I don't have time for this right now." She handed the binder to my coworker and added, "Since you are too good to work on this, you will have to take care of it." My coworker questioned, "Does that make me the manager now?" The regional manager threw a fit when both of us refused to do the extra work. After I clocked out, I sent an email resigning from my position. My coworker reported the regional manager to corporate, and they closed our store 2 weeks early. It didn't reopen the following season. Story 69. Doing telecommunications work, installing antennas on towers and rooftops. We received a job for an office building on one end and a building for AT&T on the other. The antenna platform at the AT&T building is situated on top of a 60-foot concrete silo structure with a steel platform above it. There is a door at the bottom and a ladder that goes straight up from there. Upon opening the door, we encountered 2 to 3 feet of pigeon waste, feathers, nesting material, dead and broken eggs, and dead pigeons. I said no way. My partner walked across it, finding it somewhat solid, and reached the ladder, only to discover every rung had a uniform coating of 2 inches of pigeon waste. No way. We left and informed our contact about the hazardous materials and biohazard situation, stating that we would not proceed. He complained until we sent him a picture, after which he canceled the order. Story 70. Not exactly me, but a colleague. We work on trains and one of the toilets was blocked. No problem. It has a backflush system that can clear blockages by forcing water back up the system. When you carry this backflush out, you have to close the toilet lid. My colleague did not. What occurred next I can only describe as a jet wash from a sewage fountain. It exploded and covered him from head to knee in waste that had been sitting in a tank for 24 hours. The horrifying liquid sprayed him in the face with such force that it penetrated every orifice, as if he had been assaulted by the devil himself. At first, there was a pause as we stood in shock at the abomination we just witnessed. What followed was 5 men laughing and throwing up and 1 man who looked like he had just experienced the worst possible mud spa treatment. Story 71. Today, I work at the front end of a wholesale store and was working at the register before going to the service desk. I assisted a woman with a relatively small order and politely asked her to place everything except the drinks on the belt. I waited for her, but she stared at me as if I were crazy, so I repeated myself. She became defensive and threw her items on the belt. I scanned her membership card and began processing her order. Everything seemed fine until a man, who I assumed was with her since he was watching 2 children nearby, approached and asked what was taking so long. The woman said, "I had to take everything out of the cart." And the man gave me a disapproving look and asked, "Why did she have to take everything out?" I began to explain that it was company policy, but before I could finish, he erupted at me as if I had done something personally offensive. "Why only for us? I just saw her scan items for other customers." He raised his voice and pointed to a new trainee processing a large military order. I tried to explain again, but he cut me off. They paid and left, or so I thought. I was going on my first break, feeling sore and tired just 3 hours into my shift. As I headed to the break room, someone tapped my shoulder. My coworkers know I don't like being touched unexpectedly. It turned out to be the woman I had just checked out. I forced a customer service smile and asked what she needed. As soon as she spoke, I thought, this woman thinks I'm naive. There is a giant thumbprint in my hamburger, and I would like to exchange it, she said rudely and thrust a pack of hamburger at me, revealing a noticeable thumb hole. I think you put a hole in it when you put it in the cart. I knew her companion caused that himself for 2 reasons. 1, I'm autistic and can't tolerate the texture of raw meat. The slightest touch sets me off. 2, my hands are small, and the size of the thumb hole was 3 times that of my own. With my customer service smile struggling to remain in place, I said in my politest tone, "Unfortunately, ma'am, I'm off the clock, but you can make an exchange at the service desk." I pointed toward the long service desk line. This angered her, and she stormed off as I took my break. When I returned, my manager informed me that she reported me. We reviewed the footage because she claimed I put my whole hand in her ground beef, even though my manager is aware of my sensitivity to raw meat. I saw her companion clearly put his thumb deep into the beef before sending her up. This happened in front of their 2 daughters. I believe they will be banned from the store, but I am unsure if corporate will approve it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.